I don't sleep anymore. I don't eat. I am no longer a man. I became the voice of her curse. And now the wind whispers my name. Son, executioner, child of fire. I left the village long ago. I write this from a tavern where the walls tremble from my dreams. And if you're reading this, don't become the man who follows orders so blindly. He forgets who he's killing. It all started as just a job. The way a miller grinds grain, the way a blacksmith bends iron, the way a beekeeper tends his hives. Only instead of flour, ash. Instead of honey blood. Instead of ringing steel the snap of bone. I was 16 when the Inquisitor rode into our village. He was tall, dressed in a crimson robe with a black iron cross across his chest. He didn't smile. He didn't drink. He spoke only when necessary. He looked like a carrion bird sent to peck out the eyes of the dying. My father was named Heinrich. He ran the mill until the plague took him. After that, it was just my mother and me. We survived on roots, moldy bread, and fear. When a father dies, the house goes silent even in noise. But when hope dies, it goes silent inside you. The Inquisitor needed help. Someone had to tie the nooses. Someone had to swing the axe. Someone had to burn the accused. He needed an executioner, and he chose me. It didn't take much convincing. You're strong, he said, and you don't ask questions. Why would I answered. He nodded. They gave me an axe, a rope, and a cloak the color of rot. They taught me to test knots, sharpen steel, and stack wood so it burned faster. It wasn't a sentence. It was a trade, like any other craft. The first was a woman. Her name was Magda. They said she was a witch. Her cow gave too much milk. Her garden bloomed too late in the season. And once she smiled during a funeral. People needed reasons to fear. The Inquisitor gave them a focus. Me, I was the hand. They brought her to the square, tied to a post with vines and fear. She didn't scream. She looked at me with tired, knowing eyes. And when I raised the torch, she said just one thing. You're no better than the ones who lit the fires in Rome, but your ashes will not be holy. The flames took her slowly. Her scream lasted less than her silence. I didn't sleep that night, but I ate. And the next time it was easier. There were more. A boy who talked to birds. A blind midwife accused of summoning miscarriages. A drunk who shouted at the sky, and once claimed to hear the Virgin weeping under the well. They were all condemned, and I stood over each of them with steel, fire, and silence. Soon I stopped looking at their faces. I looked at their feet instead. Shoes always said more than eyes. Were they worn thin? Mud-caked? Rich? Barefoot? Feet don't lie, like mouths do. One day, it rained. A young girl, barely older than a doll was, tied to the pyre. She kept shivering. The wood wouldn't catch. The wet logs spat and hissed. The crowd grew restless. I was told to cut her throat instead. I did. I watched her blood disappear into the puddles. And in that moment, I realized something terrible. I felt nothing. That night, I washed my hands for nearly an hour. The water in the basin turned pink, then red, then clear again. But my hands still smelled like her. My mother said nothing. She never asked what I did for the Inquisitor, but she watched me longer each day, like counting seconds before thunder. People feared me They stepped aside in the streets. Children held their breath when I passed. I had power, the kind no one envies, the kind that eats you from the inside out. And yet I kept going. I told myself I was serving order, that law needed a blade, that I was only a tool. But every night I dreamed of voices whispering in smoke. They say the mind forgets to protect itself, but the hands, they remember everything. One winter evening, as frost devoured the windows from outside, I found myself scrubbing the metal of my axe long after it had already shone. The fire was low. The tavern keeper's boy had gone to sleep, but I sat by the embers, oiling the blade like it was a child I'd failed to raise. The Inquisitor never called me by name. He called me the Hand. Not even his hand. Just the Hand. I carried out tasks, and he judged souls. It made us a perfect pair in the most hellish sense. The church bells began to toll more frequently, not for prayer, for trials. Accusations flowed like wine. Neighbors denounced neighbors. A woman scolded her husband. Which? The boy whistled too well? Touched by the devil? The nooses multiplied. So did the crosses and burning posts. I never saw the Inquisitor smile. But one morning, after a man begged for his child to be spared, I saw a flicker at the corner of his lips. It was not joy. It was satisfaction, like watching a trap snap shut on a rabbit. One evening, I came home and found my mother sitting in silence, staring at the wall. She didn't blink when I entered. I sat beside her. The silence between us was thicker than smoke. "You killed Clara's boy today," she said quietly. I didn't respond. She didn't ask how I knew it was him. She didn't ask if he screamed. Instead, she reached over and touched my hand. "You were never cruel," she whispered. "You cried when the butcher killed the pig. You buried that injured crow behind the barn. Do you remember?" I did. "Too well. Why do you keep doing it?" she asked. I looked at her. There were 1,000 answers. And none. "Because someone must," I finally said. "If I don't do it, someone else will." She turned away. "So let someone else go to hell for it." The next day, 3 more were condemned. I executed them all before sundown. But my hands trembled that night, and the dreams returned thick. Molten dreams where ash poured from my mouth, and flames licked my feet as I stood motionless. I began drinking to sleep, to silence the voices, to erase the shape of every face I'd last seen through smoke. The Inquisitor praised me. "You are reliable," he said, "and clean." That word made me laugh. Clean? I smelled of blood, soot, and damnation. My clothes reeked of death, even after they were washed. My soul had crusted over like burned bread. What part of me could possibly still be clean? Then came the girl from the river. They said she'd been talking to the moon. They dragged her into the square by her hair. She couldn't have been older than 10. She had scratches on her knees and leaves in her hair. One of her eyes was swollen shut. Her name was Elsie. They tied her up. The Inquisitor read the charges. Communing with spirits, possessing knowledge beyond her years, inciting blasphemous laughter. I couldn't believe it. Laughter? Was that now a crime? They asked her if she had anything to say. She smiled, despite the blood on her lip, and she looked at me. "Do you believe them?" she asked. I froze. Her voice was not afraid. It was curious, gentle, like she was asking me if I liked apples, or if I had ever seen the sea. "Do you?" she repeated. I felt every eye in the crowd on me, and I said nothing. I didn't answer the girl, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't know what the truth was anymore. Do I believe them? Did I ever? The Inquisitor gave the nod. I was supposed to light the pyre, but something in me cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, just a tiny sickening snap, like a rotten thread pulling loose from a tapestry. Still, I obeyed. I lit the torch. I stepped forward. The flame flickered in the wind. The sky above the square had turned grey, and just before I lowered the fire to the straw, she said, "I forgive you." Forgiveness. That word struck me harder than any stone ever thrown by the mob. I didn't deserve forgiveness. Not from her. Not from anyone. She smiled one last time, and then the fire rose to meet her. I went home that night and found my mother waiting in the doorway. She didn't speak. She didn't scold. She simply stepped aside and let me in. The house felt colder than the wind outside. She set a bowl of soup in front of me. I didn't touch it. She sat across from me. Her face was tired, older than I remembered. After what felt like hours, she said she was just a child. I didn't respond. "I named you after a saint," she continued. "Do you remember why?" "No," I lied. She reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. It was warm, too warm. I thought the name would protect you from darkness, but it wasn't enough, was it? That night, I stared at the ceiling until dawn. The boards seemed to shift in the dark, like they wanted to collapse on top of me and bury me alive. The next day, I asked the Inquisitor for time away. He looked at me as if I were made of glass. "No one leaves," he said. His voice was calm, final. "You serve justice," he added. "And justice never rests." I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just nodded. But in my mind, I felt a clock begin to tick loud and slow. The following weeks blurred together like a fever dream. More trials, more screams, more names. One morning, I woke up and couldn't remember how many I had burned. My hands had started to shake, not out of fear, but emptiness. The villagers began calling me Death's Dog. Children ran when they saw me. Even the priest wouldn't look me in the eye during Mass. I began walking at night, long walks, into the woods, past the chapel, along the riverbank. And always I found myself staring at the reflection in the water. I looked like a ghost, pale, gaunt, eyes like whetstone. I started hearing her voice, not the Inquisitor, not the girl, but my mother's. She whispered my name while I slept, and sometimes I could swear I saw her shadow at the foot of my bed. Then came the day everything shattered. It was a Sunday. The square was quiet, too quiet. Even the crows had fled. I was called early. When I arrived, the villagers stood in a wide circle, silent, ashamed. The Inquisitor waited at the center. Beside him, tied, bound, bruised, was my mother. My mother stood in the center of the square. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope, chafing her skin. Her gray hair hung like torn parchment over her shoulders. One side of her face was bruised, her lips split. She did not cry. She did not beg. She looked only at me, not accusingly, not in fear, just with knowing, as if this was always where we would end. The Inquisitor stood beside her, reading from a parchment scroll with that same flat tone he used for all his condemnations. Herbalism without license, unholy speech against the church, association with known heretics, failure to report signs of demonic affliction in her son. I didn't understand that last one. She will be tried and executed by flame, the Inquisitor said, folding the scroll. He turned to me. You know what must be done. The crowd parted behind me. They were silent, as if they too sensed the weight of the moment. My breath caught. I looked at the pyre already built in the center. Fresh wood, dry. It would burn quickly. I looked at my mother, and I said nothing. The Inquisitor approached me, lowering his voice. If you hesitate, it will be seen as treason. If you refuse, you will join her. I swallowed. It wasn't fear that made me tremble, it was clarity. A sudden, searing clarity I had not felt since I was a child. I realized this was not a test. This was the point. This was always the point. To take from me what little good remained. To make sure I was nothing but the hand. My mother was tied to the post. I was handed the torch. My arms moved on their own. My legs stepped forward like they had done 100 times before. But this time, the crowd was not shouting. They were watching, quiet, frozen. She looked at me as I raised the flame. Her eyes, still steady, still soft, found mine. And she said only one thing. It's not too late. I lowered the torch. The Inquisitor's voice cracked like thunder. Do it. But I couldn't move. My hands had turned to stone. My mother smiled, and that smile broke something inside me forever. I turned to the crowd. I saw children, parents, neighbors, all the people I had walked past for years, with blood on my boots. And I shouted, not in rage, but in mourning, "She is not a witch." Gasps. One man crossed himself. Another stepped back. The Inquisitor's hand went to his belt. He drew a dagger. "If you will not do it," he said, "then I shall." He moved toward her, and that's when I stepped between them. I stepped in front of my mother and raised the axe, not to strike her, but to shield. The Inquisitor halted. His dagger pointed at my chest. His expression didn't change. Not anger, not surprise, only calculation. He weighed my soul the way a butcher weighs meat. "You will die for this," he said. "So be it," I replied. The crowd whispered, the kind of whisper that shudders through trees before the storm hits. He moved. Fast. Too fast for a man of his age. The blade came at my throat, but instinct took over. Steel met steel. I blocked it with the flat of my axe. The sound rang through the square like a funeral bell. The Inquisitor staggered back, then lunged again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I swung, not at his head, at his wrist. The dagger flew from his hand. Blood sprayed in a thin red arc across the snow. He howled, and the spell was broken. The villagers gasped. Some backed away, some ran, but only a few stepped forward. Clara, whose boy I had executed, Gerwin, whose wife was burned last spring. Even Father Luthen, the priest, stepped between the stones and looked at me with something like forgiveness. The Inquisitor clutched his bleeding arm. "You think this will save you?" he hissed. "You think mercy will wash away the filth on your hands?" I looked down at my palms, still stained, still trembling. "No," I said, "but it will save her." And with that, I dropped the axe. It thudded into the earth like a final verdict. The villagers cut her down. No one told them to. They did it together, as if waking from a long and bitter dream. She collapsed into my arms, not from weakness, but relief. I held her the way a child holds a blanket during a thunderstorm, like she was the last good thing in the world. The Inquisitor vanished into the trees. No one followed. We left a trail of blood, and maybe, just maybe even a trail of doubt. We left the village that same night. No torches, no goodbyes, only shadows stretching behind us, long and quiet. My mother leaned on me as we walked. She hadn't said a word since the pyre. I couldn't tell if it was exhaustion or something deeper. We followed the riverbank, then the edge of the woods. The stars above were clear, uncaring. Somewhere around midnight, she finally spoke. "Do you still dream of fire?" I nodded. She didn't ask what the fire showed me. She already knew. We found a hut abandoned near the edge of a crumbling hill. Rotten roof, broken hearth, one cracked window. It was perfect. We stayed there for weeks. I hunted rabbits, boiled roots. We didn't speak much. Silence was safer. At night, I listened to the wind scratch against the boards. Sometimes I heard laughter in it. Not joyful laughter, the laughter of judgment. Mocking, cold. My hands had started shaking again. One morning I dropped the pot of water. It shattered. She rushed over and grabbed my arms, held them steady. "They'll never stop," I said. "The hands?" I shook my head. "The faces." She didn't say I was wrong. She just pressed her forehead to mine. "I see them too. One night we heard hooves. 2 riders. Soldiers. They didn't knock. They demanded names. I gave false ones. They didn't believe me, but they didn't press. Their eyes lingered on my mother longer than I liked. As they turned to leave, one said, 'Word spreads, you know. A pious man turned against the church. They say he's hiding with a witch. He spat in the dirt. Hope he burns like the rest.' After they left, my mother sat by the fire. She stared into it, like it was telling her secrets. 'I was never a witch,' she said softly, 'but maybe I should have been. Maybe witches know how to fight.' I sat beside her. 'I was never holy,' I said, 'but they made me a priest of blood.' She laughed once, a short, dry laugh. 'I raised you to be gentle.' 'You did,' I said, 'and they turned me into stone.' She looked at me. 'No, they didn't. You're still here.' I didn't know what that meant. Not then, but I held on to it, like a thread in a burning room. Spring came slowly that year. It limped across the hills with muddy boots and frostbitten fingers. The ground stayed hard, and even the birds seemed cautious. Trees budded late, as if unsure whether they still had the right. But we endured, because endurance is all we had left. We patched the roof. We grew onions in a crooked wooden box, and we pretended as best we could that we were free. But freedom has a price. One night, while I was collecting firewood, I saw smoke on the southern horizon. Too much for a chimney, too dark for brush fire. The Inquisition was moving again, and I knew what that meant. They weren't chasing witches anymore. They were chasing dissenters, those who had seen too much, those who had dared to say no, those who had held the torch and dropped it. I came home with ash on my hands and didn't say a word, but my mother already knew. She looked up from her sewing and simply asked, "When?" "Soon," I replied. She didn't flinch. She tied off the thread, folded the cloth, and said, "Then let's leave before the frost lifts." We packed what little we had: dried meat, 2 wool blankets, a dagger with a cracked hilt. She kept a pouch of herbs tucked inside her dress like a secret no one was allowed to steal. I took my axe not to use, but because I had no right to bury it. It was a part of me, like a scar you cannot cut from your skin. Before we left the hut, I looked at the fireplace one last time. Its smoke had never judged me, only warmed me. I thought, if only people were more like fires. We traveled north, always north. The mountains were rumored to be safe. Hard land, harsh winters, but far from Inquisitors, trials, and death. Along the way, we met others. A one-eyed baker, a boy who no longer spoke, a woman with 4 daughters and no shoes, a priest with no tongue, a girl who claimed her brother had been turned into a deer. All of them burned in different ways. None asked questions, none gave names, and yet we recognized one another, not by face, but by silence. We traveled like ghosts, and in that strange stillness between strangers, I found something I hadn't felt in years. Kinship. We had all lost something, but somehow we were still walking. One night, around a smoky campfire, the woman with 4 daughters sang an old lullaby. My mother hummed along. I sat in the dark, clutching the axe across my knees, as though it might vanish if I stopped holding it. Someone passed me a cup of boiled pine and honey, and for the first time, in what felt like 1,000 years, I took a sip, closed my eyes, and didn't see flames. We stayed with the others in the hills. They called the place Black Hollow, though no one knew why. Maybe because the trees there leaned like mourners, or maybe because the stars above it felt farther away. We built huts from what the mountain gave us: stone, bark, silence. I dug with bare hands. My palms bled, but it felt honest. We shared food. We kept watch. We slept light and spoke less. And in that stillness, something changed. One evening, by the fire, the baker turned to me and asked, "What did you do before?" I looked at him for a long time. My mother glanced up, but said nothing. "I killed people," I said. The fire cracked. No one flinched. No one stood up or backed away. I was the Inquisition's hand, I continued. I burned the accused. hung the condemned. I followed orders. I told myself it wasn't me, it was the law. Silence. Then the boy who never spoke, the one with the hollow stare, came and sat beside me. He placed his small hand on mine. Nothing more. And somehow, that hurt worse than judgment. Days passed. The snow melted, exposing bones the earth had hidden. Old bones, recent ones. The forest did not care who died in it, but it remembered. At night, I began to walk alone. The wind carried voices not real, but not imagined either. I heard Magda, Elsie, even the girl who forgave me with her last breath. Their words were not curses, they were reminders, and I whispered to them, I remember you. I remember your names. I remember what they did to you through me. The next time I returned to the fire, the others asked me to speak. So I told them everything, not just the names, but the sounds, the smells, the weight of the axe in my hand, the way flesh resists, the way screams change when hope is gone. They listened. No one ran. No one cursed me. They just sat closer. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Later that night, my mother and I sat alone. She took my hand. You know, she said, I still see the boy who cried when the bird died in your hands. I shook my head. That boy is dead. No, she said softly. He's just buried under ash. But you've started digging. And then she leaned in, kissed my forehead and whispered, You are no longer the hand. Spring deepened. Flowers returned to the forest, small, stubborn things that broke through frost-bitten earth like tiny acts of rebellion. The air began to smell less of ash and more of wet bark, thawed soil, and birch sap. The hut smelled of smoke and pine. My mother began to sing. Again, quiet melodies from a time I barely remembered. Sometimes I'd catch myself humming them in my sleep. One morning, while fetching water, I saw a raven land near the stream. It looked at me, really looked, and for a moment, I thought it would speak. Instead, it tooted its head and flew off. I watched it disappear into the trees, feeling strangely comforted, as if even the crows had forgiven me. We stayed in Black Hollow through summer. The children grew louder. The old woman baked flatbread for everyone. Someone began carving figures from wood, animals, saints, angels with crooked wings. And we laughed. Yes, laughed. Even me. The laughter came slowly, like thawed blood, like muscles remembering joy. It was unfamiliar, but real. When the wind shifted again and smoke rose from the southern hills, we did not run. We did not scream. We packed our things, quietly, calmly, together. No one gave orders. No one commanded. We simply moved, like water finding a new riverbed. Somewhere along the trail, I buried the axe. Not as a symbol, not for ceremony, just because I didn't want to carry it anymore. I dug the hole with my hands, laid it in like a child, covered it with dirt and pine needles. Then I stood there, whispering names into the silence. The names of those I could never bring back. My mother grew sick in autumn. Her cough returned. Her bones shrank, but her mind stayed sharp. Her gaze still pierced through lies. One evening, as the sun died in a smear of red over the horizon, she called me to her bed. "You are never meant to take lives," she said. "You are meant to carry them." "I failed," I whispered. "No," she replied, reaching for my hand. "You broke the chain. That's more than most ever do." Her hand trembled. "You are not who you were forced to be. You are what you chose to become." I wept, not as a man, not as a killer, not as a son, but as something finally shedding its old skin. "I'm sorry. I know," she said. Then her breath stopped, and with it something in me opened. I built her a cairn from white stones. Each one I chose carefully. I whispered memories into them like seeds. The others helped, but they stayed back while I stacked the last piece. It stood tall and crooked among the trees, and I carved one word into the largest stone: mercy. That night, I sat by the fire and told the children stories, not of monsters or saints, but of choices, of mistakes, of the weight of silence. They listened, their eyes wide, not with fear, but with understanding. And when I finished, no one asked if it was true, because truth, when spoken by a man who once burned for others, needs no proof. Now I sit in this old tavern, far from that valley. The fire crackles low, the ink runs dry, the snow presses against the windows, and I write these words not to confess and not to ask forgiveness. I write them for whoever needs to read them. Maybe it's you. If you're holding this, if you've made it this far, then let me say this. Darkness doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it wears robes. Sometimes it hands you a torch and calls it justice. Sometimes it stands behind your eyes and tells you you're just doing your job. But listen closely. There is another voice, quieter, buried, but older than fire. The one that says, "It's not too late. You are not just the hand. You are the one who chooses what it holds." Dumb. If this story made you feel something, anything, don't let it disappear. There are more stories buried in ash. More truths hiding behind silence. More voices waiting to be heard. Subscribe to the channel. Be here when the next one rises from the fire. Because some tales aren't told, they're confessed.